Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the kind of history that makes you check over your shoulder even though you're already lying in bed. We're talking about people, journalists, scientists, bankers, lawyers, whistleblowers, who stood up, pointed at something powerful, and said, "That's not right." And then, in a series of coincidences so tidy they'd make a crime novelist blush, they stopped being alive. Heart attacks in bathtubs, car crashes on empty roads, suicides with 2 bullets. Tonight, we're walking through the quiet, unsettling gallery of people who challenged the elite and paid the most mysterious price imaginable. So pull up the covers, because this one gets dark, but in that cozy, horrifying, you're glad it's not you kind of way. But first, before you burrow any deeper into that pillow, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me if you stumbled onto a massive conspiracy involving the world's most powerful people, what would you do? Blow the whistle? Write a book? Change your name and move to a yurt in Mongolia? I'm genuinely curious. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and get comfortable. Maybe double-check your locks tonight. Just kidding. Sort of. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why so many people who investigate powerful institutions seem to have extraordinarily bad luck with staircases? Have you ever thought about what happens to the journalist who actually finds the documents everyone said didn't exist? Have you ever questioned why a man in perfect health, training for a marathon, suddenly has a heart attack on the one day he was supposed to testify? Have you wondered what it feels like to open your front door and notice that the lock has been turned the wrong way? Not broken, not forced, just wrong? Have you ever considered how many car accidents happen to people right after they announce they're about to publish something? And have you ever asked yourself the simplest question of all? If these deaths are truly just coincidences, why do they always benefit the same people? Good. Keep those questions warm. We're going to answer every single one of them. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the 20th century, and also, unfortunately, the 21st. You're lying on a motel bed with a laptop open beside you, and the screen shows a half-finished article about money that was supposed to go somewhere and didn't. There's a coffee cup on the nightstand that's gone cold, a notebook with names circled in red ink, and a phone that hasn't rung in 3 days, which is strange, because it used to ring constantly. The air smells like stale air conditioning and cheap carpet cleaner. Somewhere outside, a car idles in the parking lot for a little too long. Welcome to the life of someone who asked the wrong question to the right people. Sleep tight. Let's set the scene, not one scene. Actually, dozens of them, because the story we're telling tonight doesn't happen in a single castle or a single courtroom or a single back alley. It happens across decades and continents, in newsrooms and laboratories and parliamentary offices and lonely stretches of highway. The common thread isn't geography, it's pattern. And the pattern goes something like this. A person discovers something they weren't supposed to discover. They tell someone, a colleague, an editor, a lawyer, a spouse. They begin to gather evidence. They make noise. And then, with the clockwork regularity of a Swiss watch that's been calibrated by someone who really doesn't want you checking the time, they die. The death is always explicable, always just plausible enough. A car accident, a suicide, an overdose, a heart attack, a mugging gone wrong in which nothing was actually taken. The kind of death that, if you squint, looks perfectly ordinary, the way a wax apple looks perfectly real until you bite into it and get a mouthful of paraffin. You're not here tonight to solve these cases. No one's handing you a magnifying glass and a deerstalker hat. You're here because the list of people who challenged the powerful and then died under bizarre circumstances is so long, so consistent, and so eerily patterned that even the most committed skeptic starts to develop a slight twitch. And that twitch, that's the beginning of paying attention. So let's pay attention. Let's start with the world these people lived in, the invisible architecture of power that most of us walk through every day, without noticing, the way a goldfish doesn't notice water. The elite, for our purposes tonight, isn't a shadowy cabal in robes. It's simpler and more boring than that. It's the network of people, bankers, politicians, intelligence operatives, corporate executives, old money families who have access to systems that the rest of us don't even know exist. Systems for moving money without it being traced. Systems for classifying information so deeply that the people who classify it forget what they classified. Systems for making a phone call that results in a problem quietly going away. These aren't movie villains. They're mostly just very rich, very connected, and very, very allergic to sunlight. The metaphorical kind. The kind that comes from transparency, investigation, and public scrutiny. And when someone turns on that light, well, that's when the accidents start. Let's talk about the authority figures. And in this particular story, authority figure doesn't mean one king or one boss. It means a loose, overlapping web of people who sit in rooms you've never seen, making decisions about things you'll never be told. You know the type. They wear excellent suits. They speak in measured, carefully lawyered sentences. They attend conferences in Davos and Aspen and places where the coffee costs $14 and the conversations cost considerably more. They sit on boards, they chair committees, they advise governments, usually multiple governments, because loyalty, like a good hedge fund, benefits from diversification. The thing about these authority figures is that they don't look threatening. That's sort of the point. A medieval king who wants to silence a critic can just have them dragged to the dungeon. Everybody knows who did it, and the king doesn't particularly care, because he's the king. But a modern authority figure, a bank CEO, an intelligence director, a pharmaceutical executive, operates inside a system that theoretically has rules, laws, oversight, journalists. So the silencing when it happens has to look like something else. It has to look like bad luck, like a tragic accident, like a troubled individual who finally gave in to their demons. And that's the genius of it in a deeply unsettling way. The authority doesn't wield a sword. The authority wields plausible deniability, which is basically a sword that's been dressed up in a nice blazer and taught to say, "No comment," with a straight face. Of course, not every powerful person is a villain. Most CEOs are just people who are very good at spreadsheets and very bad at small talk. Most politicians are just people who wanted to make a difference and got slowly buried under compromise and committee meetings. But the ones we're talking about tonight, the ones whose names keep appearing in the margins of dead journalists' notebooks, in the footnotes of sealed court documents, in the metadata of deleted emails, those ones are different. Those ones have something to protect. And the thing they're protecting is almost always the same: money, followed closely by reputation, followed distantly by whatever remains of their conscience, which at this point is probably the size of a peanut and stored in a safety deposit box in the Caymans. Let's talk about the rules, the unwritten, unspoken, absolutely ironclad rules that govern the relationship between powerful institutions and the people who investigate them. Rule number 1. You can look, but don't touch. You're allowed to write articles about corruption in the abstract. You can publish opinion pieces about how the system needs reform. You can give TED Talks about transparency. Nobody will bother you, because abstract criticism is like barking at the moon. It makes a lot of noise and changes absolutely nothing. Rule number 2. Names are the line. The moment you attach a specific name to a specific crime with specific evidence, the temperature in the room drops about 40 degrees. Suddenly, your editor gets a phone call from the legal department. Your source stops answering texts. A colleague takes you aside and says, very casually, "Are you sure about this one?" Which in journalist speak is the equivalent of a flashing neon sign that reads, "Turn back, now." Rule number 3. The warning always comes. It's never dramatic. Nobody sends a horse's head in a box. That's from movies. In real life, the warning is a rejected mortgage application. A tax audit that arrives with suspicious timing. Your child's school suddenly needing additional documentation for enrollment. A flat tire on a car you just had serviced. Little things, individually meaningless. Collectively, a message so clear you could read it from orbit. Someone knows what you're doing, and they would very much like you to stop. Rule number 4, if you don't stop, the warnings escalate. Your phone does something strange. A click, a delay, a dropped call at a very specific moment. Your laptop runs slower. A stranger strikes up conversation at your local coffee shop and asks questions that are just slightly too specific. Your partner comes home and says, "Someone called for you today." Wouldn't leave a name, and you feel it. The shift. The moment when you realize that the story you're investigating is also investigating you. Rule number 5, and this is the one that matters most tonight. Rule number 5 is the one that nobody talks about, because rule number 5 is what happens when rules 1 through 4 don't work. When the journalist keeps publishing, when the whistleblower keeps talking, when the scientist keeps testing, when the banker keeps making copies of the records he was supposed to shred. Rule number 5 has no name. It doesn't need one. It's the empty space at the end of a very long list of inconvenient people. And it is, depending on your perspective, either the most frightening rule in modern history or simply the most efficient. Let's meet some of the people who populate this world. The characters, the community, the brave and occasionally foolish individuals who looked at rule number 5 and said, in effect, "Yeah, but I'm going to publish anyway." There's Karen Silkwood. You probably know the name, maybe from the movie, maybe from a half-remembered documentary. Karen worked at a plutonium processing plant in Oklahoma in the 1970s, and she started noticing things. Contamination levels that didn't match the reports. Safety violations that got papered over. Workers getting sick in patterns that the company attributed to, and I quote, individual lifestyle choices, which is corporate for please stop asking questions. Karen didn't stop asking questions. She started documenting. She contacted the Atomic Energy Commission. She reached out to a reporter from the New York Times. She gathered evidence, real, physical, undeniable evidence, and put it in a manila folder. Because in the 1970s, whistleblowing technology was basically a folder and a prayer. On the night of November 13th, 1974, Karen got in her car to drive to a meeting with the Times reporter. The folder was on the seat beside her. She never arrived. Her car was found crumpled against a concrete culvert. She was dead. The folder was gone. The official ruling was that she fell asleep at the wheel. A verdict that might be more convincing if the rear bumper of her car didn't show dents consistent with being pushed from behind. Spoiler: no one was ever charged. Then there's Danny Casolaro, a freelance journalist in the early 1990s who was investigating what he called the Octopus, a sprawling web of connections between intelligence agencies, arms dealers, stolen software, and government corruption. Danny told friends he was close to cracking it wide open. He said he had a source who was going to give him everything. On August 10th, 1991, Danny was found dead in a bathtub in a Martinsburg, West Virginia motel. His wrists had been slashed deeply, violently, in a way that the coroner said was consistent with suicide. His notes were gone. His briefcase, which friends said was always with him and always full, was empty. The death was ruled a suicide. Danny's family pointed out that he had recently told his brother, "If anything happens to me, don't believe it's an accident." And then there's David Kelly, the British weapons inspector who told the BBC that the British government had sexed up its intelligence dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction in the lead-up to the Iraq War. David was a quiet, methodical scientist, the kind of man who spoke in careful, measured sentences and kept meticulous notes. After his identity as the BBC's source was leaked by the government, David was hauled before a parliamentary committee and publicly grilled. He was, by all accounts, humiliated. On July 17, 2003, David went for a walk in the woods near his home. He didn't come back. His body was found the next day. His left wrist had been cut. A packet of painkillers was nearby. The official inquiry ruled it a suicide, but the paramedics who found him said there was surprisingly little blood for a wrist wound. The knife was a small gardening pruner. A group of doctors later wrote an open letter arguing that the wound described could not have caused enough blood loss to be fatal. The case was quietly sealed for 70 years. 70 years, which is a lot of years to wait for answers about a man who simply told the truth on the radio. These are your companions for tonight. Karen, Danny, David, and a host of others will meet as we go deeper. They are not action heroes. They are not spies. They are ordinary people who, by some combination of conscience and stubbornness and very bad timing, found themselves standing between a powerful institution and the truth. And the institution, as institutions tend to do, chose self-preservation. Let's talk about the daily routine of someone who has decided to challenge the powerful. Because it's not what you think. You might imagine a life of dramatic clandestine meetings in underground parking garages, of encrypted thumb drives and coded messages and trench coats. And sure, some of that happens. But mostly, the daily life of a whistleblower or investigative journalist is staggeringly mundane. You wake up, you drink coffee that's slightly too bitter because you bought the cheap brand, because your income has become unpredictable ever since you started asking questions about that offshore account. You open your laptop, you check your email, which takes longer than it used to, because you now run everything through encryption software that makes your computer move at the speed of a particularly thoughtful glacier. You draft another Freedom of Information request, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of writing a letter to Santa. You're asking for something you desperately want, and the person receiving it is going to pretend you don't exist. You call a source who says they'll call you back. They don't call you back. You call another source who picks up, speaks in whispers for 45 seconds, and then hangs up mid-sentence. You write down what they said in a notebook that you keep in a bag that you keep under your desk, because after what happened to Karen's folder, you've become the kind of person who doesn't leave important documents in cars. You eat lunch at your desk. It's a sandwich. It's always a sandwich. The bread is slightly stale because you keep forgetting to buy groceries. Because grocery shopping requires a level of mental bandwidth that your brain has currently allocated to, wondering why your phone just made a noise it's never made before. In the afternoon, you write. You draft paragraphs. You fact-check. You cross-reference documents with other documents, with other documents, with other documents, until your desk looks like the evidence wall from a TV detective show, except there's no dramatic string connecting the photos, because you ran out of string last week and haven't been to the craft store. In the evening, you sit with your partner if you still have one. Many people in this line of work don't, because it turns out that being the target of vaguely threatening institutional attention is not a quality most people look for in a significant other. Your partner asks how your day was. You say, fine. They know you're lying, you know they know. You both look at the television, which is showing a cooking competition, and for 30 minutes, you pretend you are a normal person with normal concerns, like whether the souffle will rise. It doesn't rise. Nothing rises. You go to bed. You lie in the dark and listen to the sounds of the house, the fridge humming, the pipes ticking. The occasional creak of the floor that you tell yourself is just the house settling, because the alternative is that someone is standing in your hallway, and you're too tired to think about that right now. This is the life. This is the glamour of speaking truth to power. It's a stale sandwich, a slow laptop, and a fridge that hums too loudly. And yet they keep doing it. Every single one of them keeps doing it. Not because they're heroes. They'd laugh at you if you called them that. And then they'd offer you half their stale sandwich. Because that's the kind of people they are. But because they started something. And the thing they started won't let them stop. The evidence is in their head now, in their bones, in the way they look at the world. They can't unsee the contamination report. They can't unfind the offshore account. They can't unread the classified memo. And so they keep going, day after stale sandwich day, one FOIA request at a time. One unreturned phone call at a time. One sleepless night at a time, because the alternative, the comfortable, sensible, perfectly reasonable alternative of simply stopping would require them to become someone they're not. And that, in the end, is the thing that kills them. Not the institution, not the conspiracy, not the poison, or the car, or the bridge. The thing that kills them is their own stubborn, beautiful, impossible inability to look away. Let's talk about the food. And I know what you're thinking. What does food have to do with people dying under mysterious circumstances? Well, more than you'd expect. Because throughout history, one of the most reliable methods of making an inconvenient person stop being inconvenient is to put something in what they eat or drink. Poison is the silent assassin's best friend. It's intimate, it's deniable, and it pairs beautifully with a nice Chianti. In the world of intelligence agencies and corporate espionage, poison has a long and distinguished resume. The KGB, and later the FSB, developed an entire laboratory dedicated to untraceable poisons. It was called Laboratory 12, which sounds like a trendy cologne brand, but was in fact a facility where scientists spent their careers figuring out how to make people die in ways that looked like natural causes. They developed poisons that mimicked heart attacks, poisons that caused cancer over months, poisons that could be absorbed through the skin, administered through an umbrella tip, or dissolved into a cup of tea. Tea, the most civilized beverage in the world, and the KGB turned it into a delivery system for death. Alexander Litvinenko, the former FSB officer who defected to Britain and accused the Russian government of corruption and assassination, discovered this firsthand. On November 1st, 2006, Alexander met two former colleagues at a London hotel bar. They had tea. 2 weeks later, Alexander was dead. Polonium-210, a radioactive isotope so rare and so expensive that acquiring it requires access to a nuclear reactor, had been dissolved into his tea. Polonium-210 doesn't just kill you. It destroys you from the inside, cell by cell, organ by organ, in a process so horrifying that the doctors treating Alexander initially thought they were dealing with thallium poisoning because they couldn't imagine anything worse. They were wrong. The trail of polonium led investigators literally across London. It showed up on planes, in restaurants, in hotel rooms, everywhere the two suspects had been. It was, in forensic terms, the equivalent of committing a murder while leaving a trail of glowing breadcrumbs. The British government eventually identified the two men responsible. Russia refused to extradite them. One of them later became a member of Parliament, which tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between power and consequences. But poison isn't always exotic. Sometimes it's devastatingly simple. A researcher's medication gets swapped. A drink is spiked. An allergic reaction is triggered in someone whose allergies are conveniently known. The point is, food and drink, the most basic, most human, most daily of activities, become vectors of vulnerability. Every cup of coffee, every glass of water, every meal shared with a colleague could. If you're paranoid enough, and these people have earned their paranoia, be the last one, and that's the cruelest part of it, really. Not the dying. The not being able to eat a sandwich without wondering. Let's talk about health. Specifically, the health of people who inconvenience the powerful, which tends to deteriorate at speeds that would make a medical textbook weep with confusion. Heart attacks are the classic. There's something almost elegant about the heart attack as a weapon. If elegant can be applied to murder, which it probably shouldn't, but here we are. A heart attack is sudden. It's common. It happens to people every day. And unless someone specifically orders a toxicology screen looking for very specific compounds, it's nearly impossible to distinguish a natural cardiac event from an induced one. And guess what? In many jurisdictions, if the deceased has any history of heart trouble, high cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, even just being over 50 and a bit stressed, the autopsy defaults to natural causes. Case closed. File it away. Next, the CIA in documents that were eventually declassified because even the CIA occasionally loses track of its own secrets. Developed a weapon in the 1970s that could fire a tiny frozen dart of shellfish toxin. The dart dissolved on impact. The toxin caused a heart attack within seconds. The entry wound was so small it was virtually invisible. The toxin broke down so quickly it was undetectable in a standard autopsy. This isn't conspiracy theory. This was presented at a Senate hearing in 1975. Senator Frank Church held up the actual gun, which looked, rather fittingly, like something a Bond villain would keep in a desk drawer, and asked the CIA director if it worked. The answer was yes. So when you hear about a healthy 52-year-old journalist who is about to publish an expose on defense contractor fraud, and then suddenly died of a heart attack while jogging, well, maybe it was just his time. Maybe the universe simply decided that his cardiovascular system had had enough. Or maybe, and this is the thought that burrows into your brain and builds a little nest, maybe someone decided it for him. Then there are the suicides. In the world of suspicious deaths, suicide is the second most popular explanation, right after heart attack and just ahead of car accident. The suicide verdict is particularly useful because it comes preloaded with a narrative. The person was troubled, they were under stress, they had personal problems. It requires no further investigation because, in the public's mind, the case explains itself. He was depressed. She was overwhelmed. They couldn't handle the pressure. Except, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, the people who knew these victims often tell a very different story. They describe someone who was energized, focused, working harder than ever. Someone who had just made a breakthrough. Someone who told friends, "I'm about to blow this wide open." And then, 24 hours later, that person is found dead, and the official verdict is that they did it to themselves. And the documents they were working on are nowhere to be found. It's enough to make you slightly skeptical. And by slightly skeptical, I mean the kind of skeptical where you start keeping your own medical records in a fireproof safe, just in case. Let's talk about the social danger, the specific, identifiable moment when a person crosses the line from nuisance to threat, and everything changes. It's not always obvious from the outside. There's no alarm bell, no red light, no dramatic orchestral sting, but the people involved, the investigators, the whistleblowers, the journalists, they almost always feel it. They describe it in similar terms: a shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere, like the barometric pressure dropping before a storm. Suddenly, people who used to return your calls don't. Colleagues who used to have lunch with you start eating at their desks. Your boss calls you in for a meeting that isn't about your work. It's about your well-being. Are you sleeping okay? Are you managing the stress? Have you thought about taking some time off? It's concern, but it's the wrong shape. It's concern that feels like a glove being fitted, like the first draft of a narrative being written about you. This person was struggling. This person was fragile. This person was not quite right. Gary Webb knew this feeling. Gary was an investigative reporter for the San Jose Mercury News who, in 1996, published a series called Dark Alliance that linked the CIA to crack cocaine trafficking in American cities. The story was explosive. It was detailed. It was sourced. And it painted a picture so damning that the CIA itself launched an internal investigation, which, in a twist that surprises absolutely no one, concluded that there had been some oversights, but nothing systemic, nothing deliberate. Just a few bad apples in a barrel that happened to be owned and operated by the United States government. After publication, Gary's life fell apart with the precision of a controlled demolition. His own newspaper distanced itself from the story. Other major outlets, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, published pieces not investigating the CIA, but investigating Gary. His sources, his methods, his conclusions. It was a masterclass in institutional deflection. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" the machine asked, "Can we discredit the person saying it?" And they could. They did. Gary was reassigned to a bureau so small and so remote. It was practically a closet with a phone line. He resigned. His marriage ended. He struggled to find work. And on December 10th, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his home with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. 2. The death was ruled a suicide. Now, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide. Let that sit for a moment. The coroner explained that it was possible. A first shot that wasn't immediately fatal, followed by a second. And medically, that is technically possible. People have survived single gunshots to the head, but technically possible and likely are not the same thing. Technically possible is the medical equivalent of saying, "Well, I suppose a cat could learn to play the piano, but I wouldn't bet my retirement on it." Gary's story, the story he published, the story that destroyed him, was later substantially confirmed by the CIA's own Inspector General. Years after his death. Years too late. Let's talk about the human connection. Because in the middle of all this darkness, all this paranoia, all these convenient deaths, there are moments of extraordinary tenderness that make you remember why any of these people bothered in the first place. Whistleblowers are not by nature lone wolves. That's a myth. The lone wolf narrative is convenient for the institutions being challenged because it isolates the threat. One person is easier to discredit than a community. But in reality, the people who challenge power almost always do it because they care about someone. A colleague who got sick from contamination. A community that got poisoned by industrial runoff. A friend who got scammed by a financial product designed to fail. A child who was put in danger by a company that decided safety recalls were too expensive. The courage doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from connection. Karen Silkwood had colleagues she loved, women who worked alongside her on the production line, breathing the same contaminated air, and she couldn't stand watching them get sick while the company pretended everything was fine. Alexander Litvinenko had a wife, Marina, and a son, Anatoly. And when he was dying in that hospital bed, destroyed cell by polonium, his last public act was to dictate a statement accusing Vladimir Putin by name. Not for himself. He was already dead. He did it so that his family would know the truth, and so that the world would have to look at it. David Kelly had a family who fought for years, decades, to get the sealed files on his death reopened. They were told no. They appealed. They were told no again. They kept asking. Because that's what love does in the face of institutional power. It keeps asking. And then there are the unnamed ones, the sources, the tipsters, the people who handed over the folder, or made the call, or left the document where it could be found, people who never got credit, never got a movie made about them, never got their name in a newspaper. They just did the right thing, quietly, at enormous personal risk, because someone they cared about was being hurt and they couldn't live with knowing and saying nothing. In a world where trust has become as rare and as precious as a working printer in an office building, these connections, these small, fierce, stubborn acts of loyalty, are the real story. They're the reason the secrets get out at all. Let's talk about money, because if power is the engine, money is the fuel, and the exhaust pipe is pointed directly at anyone who tries to look under the hood. The financial world has produced more suspicious deaths per capita than any other industry. And that's saying something, because the financial world is also the industry that invented the collateralized debt obligation, which is a financial instrument so complicated that the people selling it didn't understand it either. And everyone just pretended they did until the global economy collapsed. But we're not here for the 2008 financial crisis, at least not directly. We're here for the people who tried to expose the machinery behind it, and who, with remarkable consistency, didn't live long enough to see their exposés published. Between 2013 and 2015, a wave of banker deaths swept through the financial world with a frequency that made actuaries nervous. And actuaries are people who are professionally trained to not be nervous about death, because death is literally their business model. During that period, more than 40 financial industry workers died under unusual circumstances. Some jumped from buildings, some hanged themselves, some shot themselves, some had heart attacks, some died in car accidents, individually. Each death was explicable. People in high-pressure industries do, sadly, take their own lives. The hours are brutal. The stress is immense. The culture is toxic in ways that make a Victorian workhouse look like a wellness retreat. But the pattern was troubling. Several of the deceased were connected to ongoing investigations into market manipulation, money laundering, or regulatory fraud. Several had recently been interviewed by investigators or had been scheduled to testify. Several worked for the same institutions: J.P. Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Zurich Insurance. Institutions that were, at the time, under scrutiny for practices that ranged from questionable to criminal. And here's the thing about patterns. 1 death is a tragedy. 2 deaths are a coincidence. 3 deaths are a pattern. 40 deaths are either the worst run of luck in corporate history or something that should make every financial regulator on the planet lose sleep. Which is ironic, given that you're trying to fall asleep right now. Sorry about that. The point is, money creates a gravity so powerful it bends the behavior of everyone in its orbit. And when someone threatens to reveal where the money went, who took it, who hid it, who laundered it through shell companies, named after Caribbean flowers, the gravity becomes crushing. Not for the money, for the person. Let's talk about the car, specifically. The car as an instrument of suspicious death. Because the automobile has been weaponized so frequently against inconvenient people that it deserves its own chapter, and possibly its own support group. Cars are perfect for the task. If you're the kind of person who thinks about such things, which, after tonight, you probably will be, and I apologize in advance for ruining your commute. A car accident is common, it's relatable. Everyone has had a near miss on the highway, a moment where the brakes felt soft or the steering pulled to one side. It's the most plausible of all plausible deniabilities, because cars are genuinely dangerous machines that kill people every day without any help from shadowy institutions. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Michael Hastings was an investigative journalist, a good one, the kind who made powerful people genuinely uncomfortable, which is the highest compliment you can pay a journalist, and also, apparently, a death sentence. Michael had published a Rolling Stone article that ended the career of General Stanley McChrystal, the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan. He was working on a new story about the CIA. On June 18, 2013, Michael emailed colleagues to say he was onto a big story and needed to go off the radar. Hours later, at 4:25 in the morning, Michael's Mercedes C250 was captured on security cameras traveling at extremely high speed through a residential street in Los Angeles. The car crossed the median, hit a tree, and exploded into a fireball so intense that the engine was found over 100 feet from the wreckage. Now, cars don't typically explode on impact. That's a movie thing. In real life, car crashes are messy and violent, but they don't produce fireballs. Michael's car did. And the speed at which the car was traveling on a straight road in the middle of the night in a neighborhood with a 35-mile-per-hour speed limit suggested either that Michael had suddenly decided to drive like a participant in a demolition derby, or that something had gone very wrong with his car. Former counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke said publicly that the crash was consistent with a car's cyber attack. Modern cars, Clarke noted, can be hacked. Their acceleration, braking, and steering can be remotely controlled. This was not speculation. It was a documented capability. The FBI later admitted that they had been investigating Hastings at the time of his death. His death was ruled an accident. No further investigation was conducted. The car, like so many of the instruments in this story, was simply bad luck. Just the worst, most conveniently timed, most perfectly targeted bad luck imaginable. Let's talk about the paperwork, because in every single one of these cases there's a moment that should make your stomach drop. And it's not the death itself. It's what happens to the documents. The documents always disappear. Karen Silkwood's folder. Danny Casolaro's briefcase. The notes from half a dozen banker deaths, the hard drives that get wiped, the laptops that go missing, the filing cabinets that are found empty. It's as if, in the aftermath of each death, a very efficient, very thorough cleaning crew sweeps through and removes every scrap of paper, every USB drive, every handwritten note, leaving behind a life that looks like it was lived by someone who never wrote anything down, never saved anything, never kept a record. Which is, if you've ever met a journalist or a whistleblower, approximately as believable as a fish that's afraid of water. These were people who kept records obsessively, who made copies of copies, who emailed documents to themselves, to friends, to lawyers, to post office boxes, who developed their own filing systems, their own encryption methods, their own dead drops. And yet, in death after death, the evidence simply vanishes. Like it was never there. Like the person spent their final years investigating absolutely nothing, and just happened to get murdered. Sorry, die accidentally? For no reason at all. The disappearing documents are the real tell. Because if someone genuinely dies of natural causes, or by their own hand, the documents stay. The laptop is still there. The files are still on the desk. The briefcase is still full. It's only when the death serves someone's interests that the evidence evaporates. And the evaporations is always complete. Never a partial cleanup. Never a missed folder in a drawer. Total erasure. The kind of thorough, methodical, leave no trace erasure that requires planning, resources, and access, none of which are typically available to the grieving widow or the local police officer who arrives at the scene and doesn't know what to look for because no one told them to look. The paperwork chapter of this story isn't glamorous. It's not exciting. It's the kind of detail that makes your eyes glaze over if you're reading a news article about it. But it's the detail that matters most. Because the documents are the proof, and the proof is always, always gone. Let's talk about the investigation, or, more accurately, the lack thereof, because if the deaths are suspicious, the investigations are downright surreal. Here's how it typically works. A person with connections to a major investigation or a pending expose is found dead. The local authorities arrive. They assess the scene. They note the apparent cause of death: suicide, heart attack, car accident, drowning. They conduct a standard autopsy, which tests for the standard things: blood alcohol, common drugs, obvious trauma. They do not test for polonium. They do not test for shellfish toxin. They do not test for the exotic, purpose-built compounds that a state intelligence agency or a well-funded corporate security team might have access to. Because why would they? This is a small-town coroner's office. They handle car accidents and overdoses and the occasional bar fight that went too far. They are not equipped financially, technically, or psychologically to consider the possibility that a death was engineered by an institution with a budget larger than their entire county's annual revenue. So the death gets filed. Natural causes. Suicide. Accident. Case closed. And even when the family pushes back, even when the family hires a private investigator, commissions an independent autopsy, retains a lawyer, the system resists reopening with the stubborn inertia of a boulder that has been very comfortable where it is. Thank you, and has no interest in being rolled uphill. In the case of David Kelly, the British government didn't just decline to reopen the investigation, it sealed the evidence for 70 years. 70 years. Let that number settle. That means the full autopsy report, the toxicology results, the photographs, the witness statements, all of it. cannot be examined by the public until 2073, by which point everyone involved will be dead. Every witness will be gone, and the truth, if it was ever knowable, will have been buried under so many layers of time and bureaucracy that extracting it will be like performing archaeology with a soup spoon. Why 70 years? The official explanation is that it's standard practice for certain types of sensitive cases. The unofficial explanation, which is the one that makes your skin crawl at 2 a.m., is that 70 years is long enough for no one to care anymore. Long enough for outrage to become trivia. Long enough for a murder, if that's what it was, to become a footnote in a textbook that nobody reads. And that's the real social danger of these cases. Not the dying, the forgetting, the slow, institutional, perfectly legal process by which a suspicious death becomes an old story, a cold case, a conspiracy theory, and therefore, by definition, not worth taking seriously. Let's talk about the crisis moment. And in this world, the crisis moment isn't a single event. It's the moment an entire institution realizes collectively that someone has the goods, the real goods, not allegations or theories or anonymous blog posts, actual documents, actual recordings, actual evidence that, if published, would bring the whole thing crashing down like a Jenga tower that's been played by someone with extremely questionable spatial awareness. When that moment arrives, the institution doesn't panic. Institutions don't panic. Panic is for people. Institutions activate protocols. Somewhere, in an office you've never seen, someone picks up a phone. The call is short. The language is vague. We may have an exposure. There's a containment issue. The situation needs to be managed. No one says the word kill. No one says the word silence. The vocabulary is all euphemism. Soft, corporate, deniable, like a knife wrapped in cotton wool. And then things begin to happen. The journalist's source goes dark. Their editor receives a legal threat so detailed and so menacing that it reads less like a letter and more like a ransom note dressed in a suit. The journalist's internet history gets pulled. Their phone records get pulled. Their financial records get pulled. Someone somewhere is building a file on them. A file designed not for prosecution but for destruction. Character destruction. The kind of carefully curated dossier that, if leaked to the right outlet at the right time, transforms a credible investigator into a discredited obsessive. She was paranoid. He had personal problems. They were unreliable. The narrative is built before the crisis even breaks. A preemptive obituary for a reputation written by people who have done this many, many times before. This is the crisis moment, not the death. The preparation, the quiet, professional, utterly merciless preparation that turns a living, breathing person into a target. And then, once the targeting is complete, turns a target into a statistic, and the statistic gets filed, and the file gets closed, and the institution survives, because institutions always survive. That's what they're built to do. Let's talk about the escape fantasy, because every single person in this story, at some point, thought about walking away. They imagined it, late at night, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. They imagined a different life, a life where they hadn't opened that file, hadn't made that call, hadn't noticed the discrepancy in the spreadsheet, the redaction in the report, the name that appeared where it shouldn't have. They imagined telling their editor, "Actually, I think I'll pass on this one." They imagined deleting the documents, reformatting the hard drive, moving to a small town in New Zealand and opening a bookshop that sells nothing but mysteries, which would be ironic, but at least the mysteries would be fictional. Some of them actually tried. Gary Webb, after being pushed out of journalism, moved to Sacramento and tried to start over. Danny Casolaro told friends he was thinking of dropping the investigation and writing a novel instead. Karen Silkwood could have stopped documenting the contamination at any point. She could have quit her job. She could have moved away. She could have decided that the safety violations at a plutonium plant in Oklahoma were someone else's problem. None of them did. And that's the thing about the escaped fantasy. It's always a fantasy, because the kind of person who notices the contamination, who reads the classified memo, who adds up the numbers and realizes they don't add up, that person can't unknow what they know. It's like trying to unsee a car accident. The image is burned into the brain, and no amount of willful forgetting can erase it. The escape fantasy is also, in a cruel way, part of the trap. Because while the whistleblower is imagining their bookshop in New Zealand, the institution is not imagining anything. The institution is acting. The institution is making calls, sending lawyers, pulling records, building the case for why this person is unreliable, unstable, not to be trusted. The institution doesn't fantasize, it plans. And by the time the whistleblower decides, as they always do, that they can't walk away, that the truth matters more than their comfort, more than their safety, possibly more than their life, by that time, the institution is already 3 steps ahead. The escape fantasy, in the end, is just another form of hope. And hope, in this world, is the most dangerous thing of all. Not because it's foolish, but because it keeps you in the game just long enough for the game to catch up with you. The bookshop in New Zealand never opens. The novel never gets written. The resignation letter stays in the drafts folder, unsent, unfinished, a monument to the life you almost chose but couldn't, because you are who you are. And who you are is someone who noticed the discrepancy. And noticing is a one-way door. You can walk through it, but you can't walk back. And the institution on the other side of that door has been waiting for you, patiently, professionally, for longer than you've been alive. It has coffee, it has lawyers, it has all the time in the world. And you have a manila folder, a slow laptop, and a bookshop that exists only in your imagination, growing fainter every day, like a dream you're trying to remember after waking, the details slipping away, the colors fading, until all that's left is the feeling of it, the warmth of the fantasy, and the cold, undeniable knowledge that you were never really going to go. Let's talk about survival, the ones who made it through. Because it's not all darkness. It's not all convenient heart attacks and vanishing documents. Some people challenged the powerful and lived. Some whistleblowers blew the whistle and survived to watch the aftermath. And their survival tells us something important about the difference between the ones who died and the ones who didn't. The survivors, almost without exception, did one thing differently. They went loud. They went so publicly, so visibly, so unmistakably loud that silencing them after the fact would have been more damaging than whatever they were revealing. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. Thousands of pages of classified documents proving that the U.S. government had systematically lied about the Vietnam War, and he survived. Why? Because he gave the documents to the New York Times, which published them. And then he gave them to 17 other newspapers. And then he held press conferences. And then he turned his own trial into a public spectacle. He made himself so visible that any accident would have been obvious. He wrapped himself in sunlight like a suit of armor. Edward Snowden leaked the NSA's mass surveillance programs and survived. Though survived, in his case, means living in Moscow, which is its own form of irony. Snowden survived because he gave the documents to journalists who published them simultaneously across multiple outlets in multiple countries. By the time the story broke, the information was already everywhere. Silencing Snowden at that point would have accomplished nothing except confirming everything he'd said. The lesson, if there is one, is depressingly practical. The best way to survive telling the truth about powerful people is to make sure you can't be the only copy. Be the document that's been backed up so many times that destroying it is pointless. Be the story that's already in 17 editors' inboxes. Be so public, so visible, so thoroughly on the record that the cost of silencing you exceeds the cost of letting you speak. It's not a guarantee. Nothing is a guarantee. But it's better than a manila folder on the passenger seat of your car at midnight. Let's talk about the quiet ones. The deaths that never made headlines, never got documentaries, never had movies made about them. Because for every Karen Silkwood and every Gary Webb, there are dozens, maybe hundreds, of people whose deaths were equally suspicious and equally convenient, and who have been completely forgotten. Lab technicians who noticed contamination levels and then had car accidents. Accountants who found discrepancies and then had heart attacks. Local reporters who published stories about land deals and then fell off bridges. Paralegals who organized documents for lawsuits and then overdosed on medications they'd never been prescribed. These are the quiet ones. The ones whose names don't appear in books or films or Wikipedia articles. The ones whose families held small funerals and asked small questions and were given small answers. Accident, suicide, natural causes. And who had neither the resources nor the platform to push further. And the quiet ones are, in many ways, the most important part of this story. Because they represent the vast, unmapped territory between confirmed conspiracy and obviously innocent. They are the people for whom we will never have enough information to know what happened. Not because the information doesn't exist, but because no one with the power to find it ever looked. The quiet ones are the dark matter of this story. Invisible, undetectable, but exerting a gravitational pull on everything around them. They're the reason the whistleblowers who do survive are so afraid, not because they know what happened to the famous cases, because they know, they feel in their bones, that the famous cases are just the tip of something much larger, something they can sense but can't see, something that shapes the landscape of their fear the way dark matter shapes the structure of galaxies, silently, invisibly, and with a force that defies direct observation. So here's to the quiet ones tonight. The unnamed, the uninvestigated, the filed away, and the forgotten. They may not have gotten justice, they may not have gotten answers, but they are part of this story, and they deserve to be remembered. Even if the only memorial they ever get is a sentence in a sleep podcast, spoken in the dark, to a listener who is probably already half asleep. And honestly, that counts. Let's talk about the media, specifically the strange, uncomfortable, deeply compromised relationship between the press and the powerful, and how that relationship shapes which deaths get investigated and which ones get a paragraph on page 17. In theory, the media is the watchdog. The press is supposed to bark when it smells something wrong. That's the whole point. That's why freedom of the press is enshrined in constitutions and charters and declarations. Because a free press is the immune system of a democracy, the mechanism by which corruption is identified and expelled. In practice, the immune system has developed a rather significant autoimmune disorder. Modern media operates inside an economic structure that makes genuine investigation expensive, risky, and career-threatening. An investigative piece takes months. It requires travel, legal, review, source protection, fact-checking, and an editor with enough institutional support to weather the inevitable legal threats. All of that costs money, and money in modern media comes from advertisers. And advertisers are, in many cases, the same corporations and financial institutions that the journalists are supposed to be investigating. So the system is essentially asking the press to bite the hand that feeds it, which the press occasionally does, but only when the hand is already injured and the biting won't cost too much. When a journalist, like Gary Webb, publishes a story implicating the CIA, the response from the media establishment isn't to rally around the investigation, it's to investigate the investigator, to question his methods, his sources, his motives, to position the story not as a potential truth, but as a potential embarrassment to the paper, to the profession, to the carefully maintained illusion that the media and the government have an adversarial relationship rather than a symbiotic one. And when that journalist dies, the coverage is brief, respectful, perhaps, sympathetic in a distant kind of way, but never followed up, never investigated with the same rigor that would be applied to, say, a celebrity scandal or a political sex tape. Because investigating the death of a journalist who is investigating the powerful means investigating the powerful yourself, and the media, for all its constitutional protections and its high-minded ideals, is run by people who have mortgages and children and careers and a very clear understanding of what happens to people who investigate the powerful. So the death gets a paragraph, maybe a column, a brief flurry of Twitter tributes, and then silence. The algorithm moves on, the news cycle turns, and the story, the real story, the one the journalist died for, gets buried under the next outrage, the next scandal, the next thing designed to consume attention without requiring action. Welcome to the Fourth Estate. It's doing its best. Probably. Sort of. In a manner of speaking. Let's talk about the legal system. Because if the media is the watchdog, the courts are supposed to be the guard dog. The big one, the one with teeth. And yet, in case after case after case, the legal system has proven itself spectacularly, almost comically, incapable of providing justice for people who died under suspicious circumstances while challenging the powerful. There are reasons for this, and none of them are comforting. The first reason is jurisdiction. When a suspicious death occurs, it falls under the jurisdiction of local law enforcement, local detectives, local coroners, local prosecutors. These are people with limited budgets, limited training, and, critically, limited appetite for taking on cases that might involve federal intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, or billionaires with legal teams larger than most countries' armies. A small-town detective who starts asking uncomfortable questions about a banker's suicide quickly discovers that the questions don't stay small. They lead to sealed records and classified documents and phone calls from people who don't identify themselves, but who suggest, very politely, that the detective's time might be better spent on other cases. The second reason is the coroner's report, which is, in theory, the factual foundation of any investigation, and, in practice, often a work of creative fiction that would make a novelist jealous. Coroners are overworked, underfunded, and under enormous pressure to close cases quickly. A death that can be attributed to natural causes or suicide requires no further investigation. A death that's ruled a homicide requires a murder investigation. Detectives, forensics, prosecutors, court time, publicity. The institutional incentive is overwhelmingly toward the simpler explanation, regardless of whether it's the correct one. The third reason is money. Legal challenges require lawyers. Lawyers require money. Families of deceased whistleblowers and journalists are almost by definition not wealthy because their loved ones spent their careers doing meaningful work that pays approximately nothing. Going up against a corporation or a government in court requires resources that most families simply don't have. And so the cases die the way their subjects died, quietly underfunded and without anyone in power being held accountable. And the law, like the media, moves on. Next case. Next filing. Next item on the docket. Justice in the end is a luxury good, available, in theory, to everyone, and in practice, to those who can afford it, which is, if you think about it, exactly the kind of system the elite would design if they were designing a system to protect themselves from accountability, which, spoiler, is precisely what happened. Let's talk about Russia. Because Russia deserves its own chapter, not because it's the only country where inconvenient people die under mysterious circumstances, but because it's the country that's most efficient about it. Russia's approach to critics and dissidents has, over the past few decades, developed a kind of grim consistency that's almost impressive in its transparency. Critics of the Kremlin don't just die. They die in ways that are clearly, unmistakably, deliberately visible, poisoned with radioactive isotopes that leave a glowing trail across London, pushed from hospital windows while recovering from previous poisoning attempts, shot on bridges within view of the Kremlin's own security cameras. The message isn't secrecy. The message is the opposite of secrecy. The message is, we did this. We want you to know we did this, and there's nothing you can do about it. Anna Politkovskaya was a journalist who covered the Chechen wars with a fearlessness that made her one of the most respected and most targeted reporters in Russia. She was poisoned on a flight to Beslan in 2004 and survived. 2 years later, on October 7th, 2006, Putin's birthday, a date that investigator chose to believe was coincidental. She was shot dead in the elevator of her apartment building. The killing was methodical, professional, and utterly brazen. Several men were eventually convicted of carrying out the murder. No one was ever convicted of ordering it. Boris Nemtsov, opposition politician, was shot dead on a bridge in central Moscow on February 27, 2015. The bridge was directly adjacent to the Kremlin. CCTV cameras that normally covered the area were, conveniently, not functioning that night. Sergei Magnitsky, a tax attorney who uncovered a $230 million fraud scheme involving Russian officials, was arrested, denied medical treatment, and beaten to death in a pretrial detention facility. He was 37. The Russian government's response to his death was to put Magnitsky himself on trial. Posthumously, they tried a dead man for the crime he had reported. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened. The Russian model is interesting because it represents the opposite end of the spectrum from the Western model. In the West, suspicious deaths are disguised as accidents and suicides, wrapped in plausible deniability and quietly filed away. In Russia, the deaths are displayed. They're performative. They're intended to be seen and understood, because the purpose isn't just to remove a critic, it's to terrify every other potential critic into silence. And it works. Of course it works. Fear is the most efficient governance tool ever invented, and Russia wields it with the practiced ease of a nation that has been perfecting the technique for centuries. Let's step back for a moment and talk about the thing that nobody ever talks about, which is the toll this takes on the people who are still alive. Not the victims, the survivors. The colleagues who shared a byline with the dead journalist. The family members who absolutely know, that the official explanation is wrong, but can't prove it. The sources who gave information to someone who is now dead, and who lie awake at night, wondering if anyone saw them hand over that envelope. The psychological weight of these deaths extends far beyond the individual. It radiates outward like ripples in a pond. Except the pond is the entire ecosystem of investigative journalism, whistleblowing, and civic accountability, and the ripples are waves of self-censorship, fear, and silence. This is the real achievement of the suspicious death, and it's the one that never gets measured. For every journalist who is killed, 100 journalists think twice about their next story. For every whistleblower who dies under mysterious circumstances, 1,000 potential whistleblowers decide that the information they have isn't worth the risk. For every scientist who is silenced, a generation of researchers learns to avoid certain topics, certain institutions, certain questions. The death is the punctuation mark. The silence that follows is the sentence. And the sentence gets longer with every death, every accident, every suicide, every quietly closed case. The institutions don't need to kill everyone. They don't even need to kill many people. They just need to kill enough, and visibly enough, that the message propagates through the system like a virus. This is what happens. This is the cost. Is your story worth dying for? Most people, when they ask themselves that question honestly, answer no. And that's not cowardice. That's arithmetic. That's a perfectly rational calculation made by a person with a family and a mortgage and a finite number of years on the planet who looks at the evidence and concludes that the system is bigger than they are, stronger than they are, and more patient than they are. The system can wait. The system can always wait. And the person, the journalist, the whistleblower, the reformer, cannot. Let's talk about what's changed, because this isn't a story with an ending, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. The world of 2026 is different from the world of 1974 or 1991 or 2003 in ways that both help and hurt the people who challenge the powerful. On the one hand, technology has given investigators tools that Karen Silkwood couldn't have imagined. Encrypted communications, cloud storage, blockchain verification, the ability to transmit a document to 1,000 people simultaneously with the push of a button. The dead man's switch, a mechanism that automatically publishes information if the sender fails to check in by a certain time, has become standard practice for high-risk journalists. The manila folder on the car seat has been replaced by encrypted files distributed across multiple servers in multiple countries, accessible only with cryptographic keys held by trusted parties. On the other hand, the same technology has given the powerful tools that are equally unprecedented. Mass surveillance, AI-driven behavioral prediction, the ability to monitor every email, every phone call, every internet search of a target in real time from a desk in an office building that looks like any other office building. The arms race between transparency and secrecy has escalated to a level that would have been science fiction a generation ago. And, like most arms races, neither side has a decisive advantage. What's also changed is the public's appetite for these stories. The internet has created a culture of conspiratorial thinking that makes it simultaneously easier and harder to get the truth heard. Easier, because platforms exist where suppressed stories can be published and shared without institutional gatekeepers. Harder, because those same platforms are flooded with genuine conspiracy theories. Flat Earth crisis actors, lizard people, that create a noise-to-signal ratio so unfavorable that a real story about a real suspicious death gets lost in the static. The boy who cried wolf has been replaced by 10 million accounts crying wolf simultaneously, 24 hours a day, and the actual wolf has never felt safer. So the situation, as of tonight, is this. The technology is better. The awareness is higher. The tools are stronger. And people are still dying under mysterious circumstances after challenging the powerful. The game has changed. The outcome hasn't. And that is perhaps the most sobering observation of all. Let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein, because you knew we'd get here eventually, and because the Epstein case is the single most high-profile example of a suspicious death in modern history, and because the circumstances are so extraordinary that they deserve to be examined slowly, carefully, and with the kind of attention to detail that a good bedtime story requires. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier, though what exactly he financed, and with whose money, remains genuinely unclear. Who was connected to some of the most powerful people in the world? Presidents? Princes? Billionaires? Scientists, celebrities. His address book read like a who's who of global power, and he was, by the time of his death, accused of running a sex trafficking operation targeting underage girls, an operation that had been known about, documented, and effectively ignored by law enforcement for over a decade. In 2019, Epstein was arrested and placed in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal facility that had successfully held some of the most dangerous criminals in American history, including mob bosses, terrorist suspects, and cartel leaders. On the night of August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. The official ruling was suicide by hanging. And then the details started to emerge. The two guards assigned to monitor Epstein's cell had both fallen asleep at the same time and had falsified their logs to say they'd been checking on him. The security cameras covering the area outside Epstein's cell had malfunctioned. At the same time, Epstein had been taken off suicide watch despite a previous attempt just weeks earlier. His cellmate had been transferred out the day before, leaving him alone. The ligature marks on his neck were, according to several forensic experts, more consistent with strangulation than with hanging. The hyoid bone in his throat was broken, a fracture that occurs in hanging but is far more common in homicidal strangulation, particularly in older adults. Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the country, examined the evidence and concluded that the evidence was more consistent with homicidal strangulation than suicide. The official medical examiner maintained the suicide ruling. The case was closed. Now, every single element of this story, the sleeping guards, the broken cameras, the removed cellmate, the overridden suicide watch, the contested autopsy findings, every single one individually could be explained by incompetence. Federal prisons are understaffed. Guards do fall asleep. Cameras do malfunction. Bureaucratic decisions are made poorly. This is all true, but the probability of all of these failures occurring simultaneously on the same night to the same prisoner, a prisoner who possessed information that could implicate some of the most powerful people on the planet, is so astronomically small that accepting it as coincidence requires a suspension of disbelief that would embarrass a children's magician. Epstein's death is the Rosetta Stone of suspicious deaths. It's the case where all the patterns converge. The convenient timing, the institutional failures, the contested forensic evidence, the powerful people with motive, the investigation that went nowhere. the public that suspects the truth, but can never prove it. It's the case that made millions of ordinary people, people who had never thought about conspiracy theories, people who trusted institutions, people who believed the system basically worked, look at the evidence and say, simply, I don't believe this. And that loss of trust, that quiet, devastating, irreversible erosion of faith in the basic fairness of the system may be the most important consequence of all. Let's talk about the intelligence agencies, because they keep appearing in these stories like a recurring background character who insists they're just passing through but somehow ends up at every crime scene: the CIA, the FFB, MI6, the Mossad, the various 3-letter and 4-letter agencies that operate in the space between government policy and plausible deniability, doing things that elected officials can later deny knowledge of, in rooms that don't appear on floor plans, funded by budgets that no congressional committee has ever fully reviewed. The intelligence world operates on a principle that sounds reasonable until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. National security requires secrecy. National security requires secrecy. And secrecy requires that certain actions be taken without public oversight. This is the logic that gave us MK Ultra, the CIA program that dosed unwitting American citizens with LSD to study mind control, which sounds like a conspiracy theory until you read the declassified documents and realize it's just history. This is the logic that gave us Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's systematic infiltration of American media organizations, planting stories, managing narratives, and turning journalists into assets. This is the logic that gave us extraordinary rendition, the practice of kidnapping people from foreign countries and transporting them to black sites for interrogation techniques that in any other context would be called torture. And this is the logic that when an intelligence agency decides that a particular person represents a threat to national security, where national security has been defined broadly enough to include embarrassment to the agency, provides the institutional framework for making that person go away, not necessarily by killing them. The intelligence community has a range of tools for dealing with inconvenient people, and murder is actually the bluntest and least sophisticated. Far more common is the destruction of credibility. The leaked psychiatric evaluation, the manufactured affair, the planted evidence. The anonymous tip to a journalist. Ironic, isn't it? Suggesting that the target has personal problems, or financial irregularities, or questionable associations. The goal isn't always to kill the messenger. Often it's to make sure that no one believes the message. And this approach has a certain elegance to it from the institution's perspective. A dead journalist is a martyr. A discredited journalist is a cautionary tale. A dead whistleblower raises questions. A discredited whistleblower answers them. The wrong way, in the institution's favor. The intelligence agencies understand something that most people don't. Reputation is more fragile than life. You can survive a car accident. You can survive a poisoning. You can even survive a gunshot wound, as some remarkably unlucky people have demonstrated. But you cannot survive the destruction of your credibility. Once the public narrative shifts from "this person is telling the truth" to "this person is unreliable," the game is over. The truth they're telling doesn't change. The evidence doesn't change. But the audience's willingness to listen changes, and that's all that matters. This is why the intelligence world is the ghost in the machine of every suspicious death we've discussed tonight. Not necessarily as the killer, though sometimes, yes, as the killer, but as the architect of the environment in which killing becomes unnecessary. Build a world where no one believes the truth teller, and you don't need to silence them. They're already silent. The noise just drowns them out. Let's talk about courage. Real courage, not the movie kind. Not the kind where the hero strides into danger with a soundtrack swelling behind them and a guarantee of survival embedded in the genre conventions. Real courage is quieter than that. It's uglier. It's a woman in Oklahoma who has already been contaminated with plutonium and knows it, and keeps going to work, keeps taking notes, keeps making photocopies of documents that prove her employer is exposing workers to radiation levels that will kill them, because she believes that the truth matters more than her own safety. And she's right, and it kills her. And the company settles out of court and never admits wrongdoing, and the truth that Karen died for takes decades to be fully acknowledged. Real courage is a journalist in Malta who has received death threats so frequently that they've become background noise, like the sound of traffic or the hum of her refrigerator. And she keeps writing, keeps publishing, keeps naming names, because she lives on an island where everyone knows everyone and the corruption is so close she can smell it from her kitchen window. And she cannot bring herself to close the window, because the smell is the truth. And truth, even when it smells terrible, is better than the artificial freshener of denial. Real courage is a man in a London hospital bed, his body being destroyed from the inside by a substance so toxic that the medical staff treating him have to wear protective equipment. And instead of spending his final hours with his family, he dictates a public statement, naming his killer, because he knows that once he's dead, the official story will be whatever the Kremlin decides it is. And the only counter-narrative is the one he can create while he still has the breath to speak. Real courage is all of these things, and it is also this. It is the knowledge that you will probably lose, that the institution is bigger and stronger and more patient than you are, that the truth you're telling may not matter for years, may not matter in your lifetime, may never matter at all, and telling it anyway. Because the alternative is silence, and silence in the face of injustice is the one thing these people could not bring themselves to accept. And here's the strange, beautiful, almost paradoxical thing about their courage. It worked. Not in the way they hoped, perhaps. Not quickly, not cleanly, not in time to save their own lives. But it worked in the way that all truth-telling eventually works. Slowly, stubbornly, accumulating like snow, one flake at a time, until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. Karen's contamination data led to safety reforms. Gary's reporting was vindicated by the CIA's own documents. Daphne's investigations brought down a prime minister. Snowden's leaks changed the global conversation about surveillance. Litvinenko's death led to the Magnitsky Act, which sanctioned Russian officials involved in corruption and murder. The truth they told is still being told. It outlived them. And it will outlive the institutions that tried to suppress it, because institutions, for all their power, are mortal too. They just take longer to die. Let's talk about you. Not the historical you, not the you standing in a contaminated plutonium plant, or sitting in a motel room with a briefcase full of documents, but the actual you. The person lying in bed right now listening to this, feeling the weight of the pillow against the side of your face and the warmth of the blanket across your chest and the gentle, rhythmic pulse of the fan that has been turning slowly this entire time, keeping the air moving, keeping the sound steady, keeping the dark soft and inhabited rather than empty and cold. And you are, in this moment, the safest you have been all day, because the day is over. And whatever the day demanded of you, the emails, the commute, the conversations, the decisions, the small and large negotiations of being a person in the world, all of that is done now, finished, filed away like a coroner's report that nobody needs to read again. And you are free to simply be here, simply exist, simply occupy this small, warm space in the universe where the only thing required of you is breathing. And you're already doing that. You've been doing it beautifully your entire life without once needing to be reminded, which is, when you think about it, fairly remarkable, because breathing is the kind of thing that sounds simple until you realize that your body has been doing it for you, automatically without complaint, through every crisis and every celebration, and every boring Wednesday afternoon, keeping you alive while you are busy worrying about everything else. And right now, your body is still doing it, still keeping the rhythm, still pulling air in and pushing it out in that ancient, unthinking pattern that connects you to every human who has ever lived, including the ones we talked about tonight. The ones who were brave and scared and stubborn and human. The ones who lay in their own dark rooms and breathed their own breaths and hoped, in whatever way hope works at 2 a.m., that the morning would bring something better than the night had delivered. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. But the breathing continued. Because that's what breathing does. It continues. It persists. It carries on regardless of what the world throws at the person doing it. And you are doing it right now, and it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. Let's talk about Daphne. Daphne Caruana Galizia, because her story is both the most heartbreaking and the most instructive of everything we've discussed tonight. And because she deserves to be the last named story before we begin to wind down. Daphne was a journalist in Malta, a tiny island nation in the Mediterranean, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and secrets have a half-life measured in hours. She ran a blog that had become the most widely read publication in the country, more influential than any of the island's traditional newspapers. And on that blog, she did what journalists are supposed to do. She investigated corruption. She investigated the Prime Minister. She investigated his wife. She investigated the network of offshore companies and shell accounts through which Maltese politicians were allegedly funneling money from, among other sources, the sale of Maltese passports to wealthy foreigners. She named names. She published documents. She connected dots. She did, in short, everything that the rules say you're not supposed to do. In October 2017, Daphne got in her car, turned the key, and the car exploded. A bomb, placed under the driver's seat, detonated remotely, killed her instantly. She was 53. She had 3 sons. Her last blog post, published 45 minutes before her death, read, "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." The investigation into Daphne's murder eventually led to the arrest of several men, including a prominent Maltese businessman with close ties to the Prime Minister's inner circle. The Prime Minister himself resigned. For a brief, unprecedented moment, it looked like the system might actually work, like a journalist's death might, for once, result in actual accountability. But accountability, in these cases, is always partial. The triggermen were convicted. The question of who ultimately ordered the killing, who made the call, who approved the plan, who decided that Daphne Caruana Galizia's blog posts were a problem that required a car bomb. That question remains, as of tonight, incompletely answered. And Daphne's sons, who have dedicated their lives to continuing her work and pursuing justice for her murder, know what everyone in this story eventually learns. The system gives you just enough justice to maintain the illusion of fairness, but never so much that the powerful are actually held fully accountable. It's a controlled burn. Just enough fire to look like fire. Never enough to actually threaten the structure. Daphne knew this. That's why she kept writing. And that's why tonight, she deserves to be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who understood the game completely and played it anyway, because she believed that the truth, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs everything, is still worth telling. And she was right. Let's talk about the families, because behind every suspicious death, there is a kitchen table where someone sits with a cold cup of tea and a stack of unanswered letters and tries to figure out what to do next. The families are the forgotten casualties of these stories. They don't get movies. They don't get Wikipedia pages. They get a funeral, a coroner's report that doesn't make sense, and a lifetime of questions that nobody in authority wants to answer. Marina Litvinenko spent years, campaigning for a public inquiry into her husband's murder. She wrote letters to prime ministers. She gave interviews. She stood on courthouse steps in the rain. The British government resisted holding an inquiry for nearly a decade because an inquiry might upset diplomatic relations with Russia, and diplomatic relations with Russia were, at the time, considered more important than determining whether a foreign government had committed nuclear terrorism on British soil. Think about that for a moment. A man was killed with a radioactive weapon in a London hotel, and the official position was, essentially, let's not make a fuss. Marina eventually got her inquiry in 2016, 10 years after Alexander's death. The inquiry concluded that the assassination was probably approved by Putin himself. Probably. The language of institutional hedging, even in the face of radioactive murder. And then there's the Webb family. Gary Webb's ex-wife and children have lived with the suicide verdict for over 2 decades. They've watched as Gary's reporting was vindicated, as the CIA's own internal documents confirm the substance of his claims, as journalists who once attacked him quietly admitted he was right. And they've watched as the manner of his death, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide, has become a punchline in conspiracy circles, a meme, a shorthand for institutional murder that gets tossed around on the internet by people who never read his actual work. That's a particular kind of grief, having your loved one's death become a symbol while remaining, officially, unsolved. The families of the quiet ones have it even harder, because they don't have the public support or the media attention. They have a manila folder of their own, full of clippings and coroner's reports, and letters from lawyers who say, regretfully, that there isn't enough evidence to reopen the case. They have a drawer in the kitchen that they don't open, because opening it means spending the rest of the day on the phone with people who can't help, and the rest of the night lying awake, wondering if they missed something, if there was a document they should have found, a witness they should have talked to, a question they should have asked. The families carry the weight of the unanswered, and they carry it quietly, because the world has moved on, and the news cycle has turned, and the algorithm has decided that their grief is no longer trending. And still, in small apartments and suburban houses and rural homes across the world, there are kitchen tables where someone sits with a cold cup of tea and wonders and waits and refuses to forget. Let's talk about the night, because this is a sleep channel, and you are lying in the dark. And it seems appropriate to acknowledge that darkness has been a recurring character in every story we've told tonight. The night is when these things happen. Karen Silkwood died at night. Danny Casolaro was found in the morning. But whatever happened to him happened in the dark. Michael Hastings crashed at 4:25 a.m. The guards watching Epstein fell asleep, or claimed to, in the small hours. The night is when the phone calls happen, the ones where the voice on the other end says something brief and then hangs up. The night is when the source decides whether to hand over the document or flush it. The night is when the journalist lies in bed and runs through the evidence one more time, looking for the connection they missed, the name they overlooked, the number that doesn't add up. And the night is when you, right now, are lying in this same darkness, listening to these stories and feeling probably a complicated mixture of fascination and unease, and something that might be gratitude, or might be relief, or might just be the warmth of your blanket against the chill of the room. The darkness is the same. The difference is what's inside it. For the people in these stories, the darkness held danger, uncertainty, the sound of a car idling outside that might be nothing, or might be everything. For you, the darkness holds a pillow, a fan, and the fading voice of someone telling you about history's most uncomfortable coincidences. Same darkness, different contents. And that difference, that enormous, luxurious, almost obscene difference, is the gap between their world and yours. They lay in the dark and listened for footsteps. You lie in the dark and listen to a podcast. They counted threats. You count sheep. They wondered if they'd see the morning. You wonder if you set your alarm. It's the same species, the same instinct to lie down in the dark and close your eyes and hope for a few hours of peace. The only difference is the cost. For them, peace was a luxury they couldn't afford. For you, it's as close as the off button on your phone. And that's not something to feel guilty about. It's something to feel grateful for. Quietly, privately, in the way you feel grateful for oxygen. Not constantly, but deeply, in the moments when you remember it's there. Let's talk about patterns. One last time, one last look at the machine before we put it away for the night. Because if there's one thing these stories share, it's pattern. And pattern is the thing that separates a list of tragedies from a system. The pattern goes like this. A person discovers something. They try to tell someone. The institution responds, first with warnings, then with pressure, then with character destruction, then with isolation. The person persists. The person dies. The death is ruled natural, accidental, or self-inflicted. The documents disappear. The investigation goes nowhere. The institution survives. The family is left with questions. The public is left with suspicion. And the next person who discovers something thinks twice before telling anyone. That's the pattern. It's the same in 1974 and 2019. It's the same in Oklahoma and London and Malta and Moscow. It's the same in plutonium plants and financial firms and government agencies and newsrooms. The setting changes. The people change. The specific poison or the specific car or the specific bridge changes. But the shape of the story, the architecture of the silencing, is always, always the same. And that consistency is either the most damning evidence that these deaths are connected by something more than bad luck, or it's the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of human mortality. You can decide which interpretation you prefer. But before you decide, consider this. If these deaths were truly random, truly unconnected, truly just the sad but statistically inevitable result of high-stress careers and troubled individuals, then why does the pattern hold? Why are the documents always missing? Why are the investigations always inadequate? Why are the files always sealed? Why are the cameras always broken? Why do the guards always fall asleep? Why does the official explanation always require you to accept multiple simultaneous failures of systems that normally work perfectly well? Randomness doesn't create patterns. Randomness creates noise, scattered, unpredictable, without shape or direction. But what we see in these cases isn't noise. It's signal. Faint, distorted, filtered through decades of institutional obfuscation and media indifference, but signal nonetheless. And signal, by definition, comes from somewhere. It has a source, and the source in every single case is the same: power, money, and the willingness to protect both at any cost. That's the pattern. That's the machine. And the machine is still running. Let's slow down. Now, let's let the heaviness lift, just a little. The way fog lifts off a field in the early morning. Not all at once, but gradually, light finding its way through in patches, warming the ground underneath. And you realize that the ground was always there, solid and steady, even when you couldn't see it through the gray, even when the fog was so thick you forgot what the sun looked like. And you stand there, or rather, you lie here, in your bed in the dark, with the fan turning slowly and the sheets pulled up to your chin, and you feel the weight of all these stories starting to settle. Not disappear, but settle. The way sediment settles to the bottom of a glass of water, and the water above it becomes clear again, and you can see through it, and what you see is just the room, just the dark, just the quiet, ordinary, unremarkable miracle of being alive and warm and safe in a place where nobody is monitoring your emails or following your car or putting anything in your tea, and you breathe. And the breath is easy, and the pillow is soft, and the stories we've told tonight are starting to feel less like warnings and more like history, which is what they are. After all, just history, just the record of what happened to people who were brave enough, or stubborn enough, or foolish enough to say the thing that needed saying. And now the thing has been said, and the people who said it are gone. But the saying of it remains. The way a bell keeps ringing after you let go of the rope, the sound spreading outward in circles that get fainter and fainter, but never quite disappear. And somewhere in that fading ring, if you listen carefully, and you don't have to listen carefully, you can just let it wash over you, like warm water, like the sound of rain on a window, like the hum of a fan in a dark room. Somewhere in that fading ring is the truth they were trying to tell. And the truth doesn't care whether anyone is listening anymore, it just keeps being true, quietly, patiently. The way the stars keep burning, whether or not anyone looks up. And you don't have to look up tonight. You don't have to do anything tonight, except lie here and breathe and let the heaviness drain out of your limbs the way water drains out of a bathtub, slowly, warmly, until there's nothing left but you and the dark and the gentle turning of the fan and the knowledge, deep, quiet, almost cellular, that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. So here you are, still breathing, still warm, still horizontal in a bed that nobody has tampered with. You've spent the last however long walking through a world of poison tea and exploding cars and documents that vanish and cameras that malfunction at exactly the wrong moment. You've met Karen, who drove into the night with a folder full of truth and a rear bumper that told a different story than the official report. You've met Danny, found in a bathtub in West Virginia, with his briefcase empty, and his wrists cut in a way that required a particular kind of determination, or a particular kind of assistance. You've met David, who walked into the woods near his Oxfordshire home and didn't come back, and whose death was sealed away for 70 years, which is a long time to wait for an answer that someone, somewhere, already knows. You've met Gary, who told the truth so loudly that the machine spent years grinding him down until he was quiet, and whose reporting was eventually confirmed by the very agency he'd accused. You've met Alexander, destroyed cell by cell by a radioactive isotope, dissolved in a teapot. His death, a trail of glowing breadcrumbs that led precisely where everyone expected, and nowhere that justice could follow. You've met Daphne, who wrote her last blog post 45 minutes before a bomb under her car seat ended the argument permanently, and whose sons are still fighting. You've walked through their world, a world of manila folders and midnight drives and sources who whisper, and phones that click, and now you get to leave it. They didn't, and that's the thing worth sitting with for a moment before you close your eyes. These were not superhuman people. They were not fearless. They were scared. Of course they were scared. Karen was scared. Danny was scared. Daphne was scared. They had families and mortgages and favorite restaurants and bad habits and all the ordinary, messy, beautiful things that make a human life worth living. And they risked all of it. Every comfortable, mundane, precious piece of it. Because they saw something wrong and couldn't make themselves look away. That's not recklessness. That's the deepest kind of courage there is. The kind that knows the cost and pays it anyway. And you, lying in your bed right now, with your clean sheets and your working locks and your phone that isn't tapped, probably, and your morning coffee that will just be coffee, almost certainly. You live in the world these people tried to build. A world where corruption, even when it wins, is at least known. Where the names are on the record, even if justice is incomplete. Where Daphne's blog posts are still online, and Snowden's documents are still public, and the Pentagon papers are still in libraries, and Karen Silkwood's name still means something. Still means 50 years after her car went off that road. They didn't fix the system. Nobody fixes the system. The system is too big and too old and too well funded to be fixed by any one person with a manila folder or a blog or a classified document. But they cracked it. They let the light in. And the light, once it gets in, doesn't go back out. That's the thing about truth. It's like water. You can dam it. You can spend billions trying to contain it, but it finds a way through. Eventually, because that's what water does, and that's what truth does, and no amount of money, or power, or plausible deniability can change the physics of it. So tonight, as you lie in the dark with the fan humming and the blanket pulled up, and the world outside your window doing whatever it does at this hour, let yourself feel the weight of your ordinary, extraordinary, unbelievably fortunate life. You have a pillow. You have warmth. You have the luxury of listening to stories about dangerous truths without being in any danger yourself. You have the most remarkable thing of all, the ability to close your eyes and know, with reasonable confidence, that you will open them again in the morning. That's not nothing. That's everything. History teaches us many things, most of them uncomfortable, many of them darkly funny, and some of them genuinely beautiful. But the thing it teaches most clearly, most consistently, most undeniably is this: that ordinary people in every era, in every country, under every kind of pressure, have found the courage to say what needed to be said, not because they weren't afraid, because they were afraid, and they said it anyway. And that stubborn, foolish, magnificent refusal to be silent is the thread that runs through every chapter of every story we've ever told on this channel. It's the thing that makes history worth remembering. It's the thing that makes the human story worth telling. And it's the thing that connects Karen Silkwood in 1974 to Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2017 to the person you've never heard of, in a city you've never visited, who is right now, tonight, at this very moment, sitting at a desk with a document they weren't supposed to have, deciding whether the truth is worth the risk. It always is. It doesn't always feel like it, but it always is. So let your eyes close now. Let the names fade. Karen, Danny, David, Gary, Alexander. Daphne, let them settle into the back of your mind like old friends turning in for the night. They've earned their rest, even if the world never gave it to them properly. And you've earned yours? Not by fighting or investigating or blowing any whistles, but simply by being here, by listening, by holding space for their stories in the quiet theater of your mind. The fan is humming. The room is dark. The blanket is warm. The world outside is vast and complicated and occasionally terrifying, but right now, right here, in this exact moment, everything is exactly as it should be. Your breathing is slowing. Your thoughts are softening at the edges, losing their sharpness, becoming more like clouds than like knives, drifting, dissolving, reforming into something gentler. You're safe. You're warm. You're still here. And that, in the grand sweep of human history, a history full of poison and paranoia and car bombs and sealed files and empty briefcases and broken cameras. That is the most extraordinary luck of all. Sleep well. Rest now. Good night.